welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at something really intriguing, a puzzle that comes straight from research you shared. We're diving into a surprising situation. African American students often have lower academic scores compared to white students, but at the same time, they report feeling just as good about themselves, sometimes even better.
It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Usually you'd expect that if someone isn't doing as well, in school, that might chip away at their self-confidence.
Right.
You get feedback on your performance, you compare yourself to classmates, and there are external judgments too.
Yeah,
So this difference in what the data shows is definitely worth digging into.
absolutely. And the piece of research that's really at the heart of this for us today is Colette Van Leer's study from the year 2000. We're going to be exploring this through the idea of attribution, basically, how these students explain their academic results to themselves.
How they make sense of it.
Yeah. Our goal, as always, is to get to the core of this, highlight the key insights, and give you a clear understanding of why this unexpected pattern exists and, well, what it means.
Okay, let's get into the numbers behind the achievement gap. What's the story there?
Well, the data reveals a pretty persistent challenge, actually, despite some initial progress in the past. One concerning statistic is the higher rate at which African American students leave college before graduating. We're talking about as many as 62% compared to around 40% for all students. Yeah. That's a significant difference in completion rates.
Wow. Yeah.
And what's more, this gap in achievement seems to widen as students go through the education system.
Right. The research mentions some pretty striking figures from the National Center for Educational Statistics. For example, the difference in reading levels between black and white 13-year-olds is noticeable, but by the time they're 17, that gap has unfortunately grown even larger.
Yeah, it widens. It's as if the average black 17-year-old reads at a level comparable to, like, a 13-year-old white student. So you're seeing this significant and persistent academic disadvantage. Now, hold that thought, because what's truly striking is what we find when we look at how these same students feel about themselves.
Exactly. While there was a positive trend of more African American students enrolling in higher education up until the late 1980s, that progress has since kind of leveled off.
Stalled out.
Yeah, stalled. Meanwhile, enrollment rates for white students have continued to increase, unfortunately widening the enrollment gap again. And when we look at who actually finishes college, the disparity remains.
Still there?
Back in 1971, black young adults were much less likely to have a college degree than their white peers, and 2 decades later, that same level of difference was still there.
And it's not just about looking back, is it? There are also predictions about the future that raise concerns. The Council for Aid to Education suggested back in 1997 that rising tuition costs could actually lead to fewer African American students enrolling in college in the years to come. So the data clearly points to a real and ongoing challenge in academic achievement.
No doubt.
But this is where the unexpected part comes in, isn't it? When we consider their self-esteem.
Precisely. Despite these academic headwinds, study after study, and we're talking about research from folks like Crocker and Major, Graham, Rosenberg, and many others, consistently shows that African American students report levels of self-esteem that are just as high as, and often even higher than, those of their white peers.
Just as high or higher.
Yes. This is a pattern that holds up across different ages and educational settings.
It's definitely not what you'd expect. If you're facing more difficulties in something as significant as your education, wouldn't that naturally lead to feeling less good about yourself?
Right.
But the research consistently points in the other direction. And it seems the connection between doing well in school and how you feel about yourself overall isn't the same for African American students as it is for white students.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is the weaker link between academic performance and self-esteem, specifically for African American students. Research by people like Allen and Haniff, Osborne, and others indicates that this connection is often quite loose. And in some cases, it seems to become even weaker as students get older, as Osborne's work suggests. It's almost as if their sense of self-worth isn't as tied to their academic achievements compared to their white counterparts.
Which really goes against a lot of common assumptions about how we evaluate ourselves.
Yeah.
So researchers have looked at other possible explanations for this surprising finding, right? The paper touches on a couple of interesting ideas.
Yes, one thought was that maybe these general measures of self-esteem weren't really capturing how students felt about their academic abilities specifically.
Like maybe globally they felt okay, but academically not so much.
Kind of. The idea was that perhaps African American students had lower self-confidence when it came to school, even if their overall self-esteem remained high. But Sandra Graham's review of 18 studies that specifically looked at academic self-esteem actually found the opposite to be more common.
Oh, interesting.
Many of those studies showed Black students reporting higher academic self-esteem than white students, and the few that found the reverse were older studies from the 1960s. So the idea that it's just about measuring the right kind of self-esteem doesn't fully explain the paradox.
That's a really important point to clarify. So it's not just that their general self-esteem is high while they secretly feel bad about their academic performance. The research suggests something more complex is going on.
Definitely.
What about this idea of disidentification or disengagement from academics?
That's another compelling piece of the puzzle. The theory suggests that some African American students, maybe as a way to protect themselves from negative stereotypes and systemic barriers in education, might start to detach their sense of self-worth from their academic performance.
So like school isn't everything.
Exactly. They might consciously or unconsciously decide that doing well in school isn't as central to who they are. If you don't heavily invest your identity in something, then setbacks in that area might not affect your self-esteem as much. Researchers like Crocker and Major, Steele and Fordham and Ogbu have explored this idea, and it seems to play a role, in this situation.
That makes sense. If you're not all in on something defining your worth, then challenges in that area might sting less. But Van Leur's work really focuses on a different, though related idea, doesn't it? The concept of attribution.
Exactly. Van Leur's research dives into attribution theory, specifically using Wiener's model of how we explain why we succeed or fail. She proposes two possible ways to understand this paradox through the lens of attribution.
Okay, let's break down those two ideas. The first one is the self-esteem model. What does that suggest?
So the self-esteem model, which ultimately wasn't supported by the research, suggested that African American students facing academic difficulties might internalize negative messages from society.
Blame themselves.
Yeah, they might blame themselves for their struggles, perhaps believing they lacked ability or something. This self-blame, according to the model, would lead to lower self-esteem, which in turn would hurt their motivation and lead to poorer performance, a kind of negative cycle.
That sounds like a really damaging process.
Yeah.
But the research points to a different explanation, the external attribution model. Tell us about that.
Right. The external attribution model suggests a different path. Instead of blaming themselves, African American college students become increasingly aware of potential barriers and discrimination that might be hindering their progress in their studies.
Things outside their control.
Exactly. They start to attribute their lower outcomes to these external factors, things like systemic issues, prejudice, lack of opportunity. This way of explaining their challenges, while it might not immediately improve their academic situation, acts as a buffer for their self-esteem. It protects how they feel about themselves because they're not holding themselves solely responsible. However, this model also suggests that if they consistently attribute their difficulties to these stable external causes, it could potentially lower their expectations for future success.
So it's a kind of trade-off. Self-esteem is maintained, but maybe at the cost of feeling less optimistic about what the future holds, particularly economically. Now, what evidence supports this external attribution model? The paper goes into quite a bit of detail.
It does. One important piece of evidence is that African American students often start out with high academic expectations and tend to attribute their successes and failures to their own efforts, especially in high school.
So initially, they do feel responsible.
Yes. Studies have shown that before college, their educational goals are often just as high, if not higher, than those of their white peers. They expect to go to college and even pursue advanced degrees at similar rates. And research on what's called locus of control, whether you believe you control your own destiny or are controlled by external forces, suggests that in high school, Black students tend to have a similar or even more internal locus of control than white students.
More internal. Interesting.
Yeah, which supports the idea that they begin their higher education believing in their own ability to shape their outcomes.
That's a really important starting point. They're not entering college with lower self-belief or already feeling like external obstacles are going to hold them back. So what happens when they get to college that might shift this?
This is where the college environment itself can play a big role. In predominantly white institutions, there's often a greater awareness of group differences and social comparisons. This can lead to an increased awareness of potential discrimination.
Makes sense. You notice differences more.
Think of it this way. If you're constantly comparing yourself to a group that seems to have more advantages, you're more likely to notice inequalities or potential biases.
The paper mentions Aston's long-term study, which found that as they went through college, African American and white students increasingly had different views on whether racial discrimination was still a significant problem. That suggests a growing awareness among Black students during their college years.
Exactly. And it's not just passively noticing things. Aston also found that participating in workshops that focused on race and culture in college made students more likely to see discrimination as a societal issue.
Ah.
Since African American students tend to participate in these kinds of programs more often, it likely contributes to this increased awareness and the shift towards attributing outcomes to more external factors.
So experience and discussion fuel this shift.
Seems like it. And when you look at studies on locus of control specifically among college students, the picture is different from what we see in high school. These studies show Black students tending to attribute outcomes more to external factors than their white peers.
The pattern flips.
Yeah, it seems that the college experience itself contributes to this shift in how they explain their academic results. It's not just something they bring with them, it develops.
So the college environment appears to be a catalyst for this change in how African American students explain their successes and challenges. But how does this connect back to protecting their self-esteem?
Okay, so this is where Wiener's attribution theory becomes really important. When you attribute negative events to external causes, like discrimination or systemic barriers, it shields you from blaming yourself. It takes the personal sting out of it, you know?
Like, it's not my fault.
Exactly. And several studies support this idea. For example, research by Oiserman and colleagues found that being aware of racism was actually linked to higher self-esteem in African American individuals.
That seems counterintuitive at first glance.
Well, it suggests that recognizing external barriers can actually help maintain a sense of personal worth because you're not internalizing the negativity. Similarly, Crocker and her team found that when people received negative feedback, it was less damaging to their self-esteem if they could attribute it to external biases, like prejudice.
So by thinking this isn't necessarily about my own lack of ability, but about external factors, they're safeguarding their self-esteem in the face of academic difficulties.
Precisely.
And this leads to that weaker connection we talked about earlier between academic results and self-esteem.
Exactly right. If you're explaining your academic struggles as being due to external factors, then those struggles are less likely to negatively impact how you feel about yourself overall. Research by Allen and Haniff, Demo and Parker, and Osborne, among others, has indeed found this weaker relationship between academic achievement, things like grades or test scores, and self-esteem for Black students compared to white students.
Okay, so self-esteem stays relatively high, protected by these external explanations. But the model also suggests that these explanations can lead to lower expectations, particularly for what they might achieve economically in the future. How does that work?
Well, while attributing challenges to external factors can protect self-esteem, especially if those factors are seen as stable and ongoing, like systemic issues.
Things that aren't going away quickly.
Right. It can also reduce optimism about future opportunities. If you believe that external barriers will consistently hinder your progress, it's understandable that you might have lower expectations for things like your future earnings or your socioeconomic status down the line.
Makes sense.
Now, research on locus of control and expectations is a bit complex, partly because it's hard to measure, and partly because it's really important to distinguish between what people hope to achieve their aspirations and what they realistically believe they will achieve their expectations.
The dream versus the reality check.
Exactly. And this difference between aspirations and expectations is particularly relevant for groups who may perceive significant barriers in their path. Think of it like this. Your aspiration might be to run a marathon, but your expectation, based on your current training and maybe an old injury, might be to finish a 5K this year.
Okay.
For African American students, the aspiration for success might be just as high, but the expectation of achieving it might be tempered by the perceived external barriers.
Right. You might have big dreams, but if you see significant obstacles in your way that you don't control, your actual belief in reaching those dreams might be lower. And this brings us to Van Lore's own research, the 2 studies she conducted at UCLA. What did those show?
Van Leur's studies provided strong support for this external attribution model. Her first study, which looked at students at one point in time, a cross-section.
The snapshot.
Yes, a snapshot. It found that older African American students were significantly less likely to attribute their future economic success to their own internal factors compared to both younger Black students and older white students.
So less belief that it's all on them.
Right. They were less likely to believe that their future financial well-being was solely in their own hands. And importantly, these older Black students also had considerably lower expectations for their future economic outcomes.
Lower expectations. But what about self-esteem?
Well, despite this, and consistent with all the earlier findings, African American students across all college years had higher self-esteem than their white peers, and there was no decrease in self-esteem for the older Black students.
Wow. So lower expectations, more external attributions, but self-esteem stays high.
Exactly. And white students, in contrast, didn't show significant changes in their attributions, expectations, or self-esteem throughout their college years in that study.
That's a really revealing snapshot of what might be happening during the college experience for these students. And the study that followed students over time seems to add even more insight, right? The longitudinal one.
It does. The longitudinal study followed students from the summer before they started college through their first year. It revealed that before college, both Black and white students had very similar, and actually even slightly higher for Black students, high hopes for their future economic success and academic performance.
High hopes going in.
Very high. Black students also placed a high value on academic achievement at this point. However, after just 1 year of college,
Things change.
yeah, African American students reported feeling academically disappointed. They thought they performed worse than their peers. They somewhat devalued academic success. They worried about confirming negative stereotypes.
Stereotype threat.
Yes. And they showed a significant drop in their expectations for their future economic well-being.
A significant drop.
Yes. And they also started attributing their outcomes more to external factors. Yet, through all of this, their self-esteem remained stable.
Stable self-esteem despite the disappointment and lowered expectations. Fascinating.
It really is.
So, the initial optimism and belief in their own agency seem to be challenged by the college experience, leading to a shift in how they explain their results and a lowering of their future expectations, but crucially, without a dip in their self-esteem. What about motivation? The paper touches on how these explanations might affect their drive to do well in school.
This is another really fascinating aspect of Van Leer's research. Her first study found that Black students who attributed lower outcomes to external factors actually showed higher academic motivation.
Higher motivation. That seems backward.
Well, especially when they also attributed their successes to internal factors. It's as if they're saying, okay, even though there might be external obstacles making things harder, sometimes external attribution for failure, my own effort still matters when I do succeed, internal attribution for success. That combination seemed to fuel motivation.
Okay, that makes more sense. It's a specific combination.
Right. And the statistical analysis in the study further supported these connections. It showed that lower perceived academic performance led to more external attributions, as we discussed. External attributions, in turn, lowered future economic expectations for both groups. Internal attributions boosted self-esteem, though this effect was a bit more complex for Black students, influenced by how well they thought they were doing.
Okay.
And importantly, for Black students, lower expectations were linked to higher motivation.
Lower expectations, higher motivation. How does that work?
The researchers explained this by suggesting that attributing failures to external things was driving both the lower expectations, the system might hold me back, and the increased motivation, so I need to work even harder to overcome those barriers.
Like a prove them wrong mentality, maybe?
Possibly, yeah. Or just a recognition that more effort is needed given the perceived obstacles. Also, self-esteem itself had a stronger positive impact on motivation for Black students than for white students in this model.
So it's not as simple as saying that explaining things externally leads to less motivation. It seems to depend quite a bit on how they explain both their successes and their failures, and how self-esteem fits in. This has some pretty important implications for how we think about education, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Van Laar suggests that our perhaps traditional worries about low self-esteem being the main hurdle for African American students might be, well, misdirected.
They're looking in the wrong place.
Potentially. The evidence strongly suggests that their self-esteem is generally robust, often even high. Instead, the more pressing concern appears to be their growing doubts about whether their hard work will actually lead to fair rewards. Due to perceived limitations in opportunity, systemic barriers, discrimination, those external factors we talked about.
That's a really fundamental shift in how we might approach this.
Yeah.
It's less about a lack of belief in themselves and more about a concern about the fairness of the playing field, essentially.
Exactly. And this has implications for how we talk about race and achievement with students. For example, parents often struggle with this, right? How do you discuss discrimination without discouraging your children or making them feel helpless?
Yeah, that's a tough balance.
It is. And the research suggests we might need to address the issue of opportunity more directly in educational settings. Perhaps through open discussions about the challenges and potential biases that underrepresented minorities might face, while also highlighting strategies for navigating these challenges and emphasizing paths to success. But, more research is definitely needed to understand how these kinds of messages actually affect motivation and outcomes.
And the environment within educational institutions themselves seems really critical here.
Hugely critical. Creating inclusive and supportive environments on college campuses is crucial. The ongoing debates around things like affirmative action, for example, and potential increases in intergroup tensions could, perhaps unintentionally, be creating less welcoming spaces for minority students.
Making those external attributions seem more plausible.
Precisely. Which might be contributing to these patterns and how they explain their outcomes and what they expect for the future. We need to foster more positive interactions and address issues related to feeling disconnected from academics, that disidentification idea, and the impact of negative stereotype threat.
Right.
Ultimately, this also points to the need for broader changes in educational policy to ensure that everyone really does have a fair shot at every level. We need to figure out what strategies are effective in creating that equity and address the systemic issues that are contributing to these disparities in the first place.
So, to kind of wrap this up, the surprising situation, this paradox of lower academic achievement but higher self-esteem in African American students, appears to be largely due to their increasing tendency, especially in college, to attribute academic challenges to external factors.
Things like systemic barriers, discrimination.
Right. And this helps protect their sense of self-worth, keeps that self-esteem high, but can unfortunately lead to lower expectations for future opportunities, particularly economic ones, and it affects their motivation in complex, sometimes surprising ways.
The key takeaway here, I think, as you said, is that the main issue isn't necessarily a lack of self-belief among these students. It seems to be more about a growing concern, grounded in their experiences and observations, about whether the system is fair and accessible, and whether their hard work will truly lead to the same rewards as it might for others.
It really gives you food for thought. So as a final point for our listeners to consider, maybe think about how these patterns of explanation, these attributions, might play out in other areas of life where inequalities exist.
Yeah, beyond academics.
Right. How might different groups explain disparities in wealth or health outcomes or career progression? And what role do our institutions, schools, workplaces, government play in shaping these explanations and, importantly, in promoting a genuine sense of equal opportunity for everyone?
It's a complex interplay, isn't it? Between individual psychology, how we think and feel, and the wider societal structures we live in.
Definitely. And understanding that interplay seems crucial if we want to tackle persistent inequalities effectively. Thanks for exploring this deep dive with us.